China and India will soon become the world's largest economies, but will they catch up with the West? WORLDwrite helped organise the Battle of Ideas Festival Emerging Economies strand, and WORLDbytes reports on the first debate for this programme.
Hi, this is Ning Xia reporting for WORLDbyte. I'm here at the Battle of Ideas event at the Royal College of Art. The Battle of Ideas is a weekend of debates, and we have over 60 volunteers taking part. Now, I'm going to speak to some of our volunteers to find out what they have got out of the section for Battle for Prosperity.
So I've just been to the session on China and India, are they catching up with the West? And a whole range of speakers, and I was expecting there to be a bit more scepticism actually about sort of the growth of China and India, you know, all the environmental costs and what have you. And though we did hear that, it's quite refreshing to hear also that everyone seems to be quite encouraging about the growth of India and China. We heard that, for example, perhaps China and India as well are going to be the same level of income that we are sort of enjoy today in the West by 2050.
I appreciated the celebration of the benefits of growth coming to China and the idea, the potential that it has for Asia possibly outstripping the West, and the benefits for the Asians as well as people in the West that we all can gain from this dynamic process of growth that's happening in Asia.
What actually attracts me in this session is actually the discussion, the debate about good growth and bad growth. I think that's quite, Dr. Lu's opinion on that is quite interesting and quite, inspiring, because she actually discussed about the nature and the structure of the growth. She shed light on different perspectives of growth to interpret what kind of growth is healthy for the long-term economy and for the whole world.
I thought it was really interesting, actually. It was good that quite a lot of the audience were really pushing for a pro-growth perspective on the emerging economies, which you don't really hear very much, I have to say.
Never has the world seen the simultaneous, sustained takeoff of two nations that together account for about a third of the planet's population. One thing is for sure, in the coming decades, there will be a shift in the power balance, or at least a greater distribution of it. But let's not forget that both China and India are still desperately poor countries. Over 60% of their population earns less than $2 a day. They account for just a mere 6% of the world's GDP, which is half that of Japan today. Nearly half of China's labor force remains in the agricultural sector. In India, it's about 60%. China is now one of the most unequal societies in the world. And these inequalities, particularly the rural-urban divide, are tending to create certain restiveness. In India too, the pursuit of economic growth has created a gaudy elite and widened already alarming differences between the socioeconomic disparities. Lifting them out of poverty will remain a Herculean task for decades to come. For all the huge advantages they now have, India and China cannot assume that their role as superpowers is assured. They must keep growing rapidly just to provide jobs for tens of millions entering the workforce every year, and to keep many millions more from crashing back into poverty.
Are China and India going to catch up to the West? And my answer is yes, they are unquestionably going to catch up. I'm thinking about the average standards of living, the per capita incomes of these countries catching up with the West. Yes, they are going to do that. What's happened over the last 500 years is that for complicated reasons, they slipped behind. And now they're catching up again, but they're really just regaining the position they've had before. China is in the process of catching up probably faster than Japan did. What's this world going to be like in which China and India have the same standard of living as the West? One important thing is that the West, today's rich countries, are going to be richer than they now are, but not by anything like as much as you would imagine by extrapolating their growth rates over the past 30 years. Two things are going to change that. One is a massive rise in the price of natural resources, and the other is the erosion of the technological rents that the rich countries now have. I mean, they're able to have higher incomes, charge higher prices, because their goods are more technologically sophisticated than those of the Asian countries, India and China. That is changing fast. China and India, at this point, are going to be the only two countries in the world that matter. Each of them is going to account for more than a fifth of world GDP and world population. Each of them is going to be 3 times as large as the United States, 3 times as large as Western Europe. The only geopolitical issue at that point is going to be what is the nature of the relationship between India and China. And what worries me about this scenario most of all is that nobody seems to be thinking about it strategically, or at least nobody is thinking about it and talking about it in public. Thank you.
Development and dependence on the world economy go in tandem. That in fact, I would say it is a sign of the stage and the maturity of development, particularly in China, but also to a lesser extent India. It is the very factor that they have been impacted by the storm from the West, which confirms that they are now far along the road of economic development because they are much more integrated into the rest of the world. I mean, if you want to say who is the most, or which is the most dependent country in the world, I would say that's self-evidently the most developed country in the world, namely the United States, and not just in terms of its reliance on capital flows recently. So the most advanced and integrated economy in the world has most interlinking relationships and linkages with the rest of the world. And you can go through to look at India. Those relationships between India and the rest of the world means that when the companies for which India is providing IT services slow down, then that is bound to have an impact within India. And finally on China, an economy whose export dependence is overstated, but the reality is that about 10% of value added in China is based upon exports. Exports have been responsible for 2–2.5% of those 10–12% growth rates over the last few years. So if you have European and American markets drying up and everyone retrenching, then it is bound to have an impact. We can actually see that this global character of the recession, the global character of the financial crisis, to me vindicates the stage of development which those economies have achieved. Far from the global recession sort of exposing the fragility of what's been going on in China and India, it actually shows the opposite. So, to conclude then, the global character of this recession, I think, does not in any way challenge or refute the idea of the rapidity and the substance and the solidity of the developments which have taken place, particularly within China, but through that China as the powerhouse for the East Asian region. But actually, in fact, the character of the global recession does highlight how much the most important thing that is happening, which is this shift of economic strength from one part of the world to the other, which is really the most important question facing us over the next 10–15 years, the shift from west to east. The cause of the problems in the West are homegrown. They're in that banking, emerging, financial crisis within the West. The problems in the emerging economies are entirely spillover problems. They are not intrinsic to those economies. They're not intrinsic to what's going on in the region. There is no banking crisis within Asia. They are the spillover effects because of the integration and the positive sign of that integration of those economies into the world. So I think while we look through what is going to be, I think, a very dislocated, a very disrupted period in the emerging economies, not just the next few weeks, but possibly for the next few months, possibly the next few years, you are going to see big dislocations. China could take a much bigger hit than people are saying at the moment. But underneath that, working away underneath, I think it would be very wrong to conclude that somehow these developments are arresting the shift of economic power from west to east. Much more likely, we're going to see underneath it all, over the next months, and importantly over the next 4 or 5 years, as the world works its way through this, we're going to see an acceleration of those trends, and we're going to see a situation in 3–4 years' time where India and China are even further advanced with respect to their position in the world economy.
I hope the observations that I will give will trigger some thoughts or debates later on. The first observation is about growth. I think everybody many people maybe already know that last week the newest release of the GDP figure by the National Statistics Bureau of China shows that over the past 3 decades, the average annual GDP growth rate is 9.8%, which is much higher than the world average at 3%, which is similar to a little bit higher than those for Japan and Korea during their takeoff period. And normally, for a long time, the drivers of this growth are external demand, exports, foreign direct investment, and public expenditure. However, what I have found is the major drivers of the GDP growth, of the TFP growth, the productivity growth in China during the past 5 years, the main driver is technical change. The nature of growth, the quality of growth started to change in China. But instead of inputs-driven, now is technology-driven. This is a change. Of course, still a gap to that of the US and the West. And the second observation is about development aspect. Last year, I went back to China to a remote mountainous area, one of the poorest area in China. I was there 23 years ago when I was an undergraduate student. And last year I went back. That area normally people use in the wooden houses, and without any decent windows. And last year I can find these wooden houses. What I can see around the road and in the countryside are brick-built, 2-floor small houses. So I have been very conservative, very cautious about the development aspect. But last year, this experience, this trip, made me changed somewhat my view about development, the impact of reforms and openness on development in China. Really, the poverty, the figures show 300 million people were lifted from poverty, under the poverty line to above it, during the past 3 decades.